Well, hello. My name is Asma. I'm a PhD student at the National School of Business and Management, working in the Laboratory of Business Management, Department of Data Processing and Quantitative Techniques Applied to Management in Agadir, Morocco. The title of my presentation will be COVID-19, Border Restrictions, Tourism and Geopolitical Impact. I'm very glad to be part of this conference and speaking on behalf of my two professors, Mr. HOUSSAS and LAHFIDI Abdelhaq. Well, the plan of my presentation will be as follows. We're going to have, first of all, an introduction. Second of all, we're going to talk about geopolitics, tourism, and international sanctions. And next, we're going to talk about sanctions and its link with COVID-19 pandemic. And last but not least, we're going to talk about travel restrictions and the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're going to end up by making a conclusion. Since its inception in China in December 2019, the new coronavirus COVID-19 has spread rapidly around the world. As of August 23, 2020, more than 23 million people have been infected and more than 800,000 deaths have been reported according to the World Health Organization. Well and all, in 2020, have mentioned that many countries have adopted measures unprecedented since the end of the World War II to contain the spread of the virus and reduce the number of cases and deaths. Among the various non-pharmaceutical interventions, like we call NPIs, that have been put in place to curb the spread of COVID-19, many countries and regions have put in place strict border controls and severe restrictions on international travel. For example, at the country-wide, the United States has imposed drastic travel restrictions on European countries that are members of the Schengen borderless travel zone, while the European Union has also undertaken the complete closure borders for non-European Union countries, or may I say Schengen countries. This shows how geopolitical relations have largely emphasized restrictions or the ease of travel restrictions. Tourism-related mobility restrictions, whether for biosecurity or political reasons, are not new. A notable example is the long-standing United States sanctions and embargo against Cuba, which banned virtually all United States exports to Cuba, preventing Americans from doing business with Cuba as well, and even preventing third parties who do business with that country from trading with the United States. It also severely restricted United States citizens and residents wishing to travel to Cuba, as well as the sanctions against cruise lines and the flight bans. More recently, the executive order signed by the ex-President Trump, known as the Trump travel ban, which imposed strict restrictions on travel to the United States for citizens of Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, and has imposed visa restrictions. In addition to these general restrictions on mobility associated with power and government, there are also travel bans in the form of blacklists and admission restrictions as part of sanctions, so-called SMART, on individuals and entities in target countries. However, tourism is among the sectors most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has impacts on economies, public services, and future prospects on all continents. The pandemic is an unprecedented test for public policies around the world. The authorities have made decisions in a situation of great uncertainty. However, the COVID-19 crisis raises substantial questions about the legitimacy of international economic sanctions, which, in addition to affecting tourism-related immobility, hamper humanitarian crisis management and response measures. For example, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the unilateral United States sanctions regime against countries like Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela has been criticized for hindering the ability to respond to COVID-19 with calls to the Trump administration temporarily lift sanctions against these countries for peaceful and humanitarian purposes and help the health systems of these countries to fight the pandemic. The United Nations Special Rapporteur also called for a human rights approach to deal with the COVID-19 crisis by lifting all unilateral sanctions that hinder humanitarian responses from sanctioned states in order to enable their systems healthcare organizations to fight the COVID-19 pandemic and save lives, according to the United Nations Human Rights in 2020. This highlights the wider discussion about routine tourism in economic governance, given that sanctions often inflict devastating economic and humanitarian costs and often fail to achieve their political goals, as well as the relationship between sanctions and notions of justice applied to mobility and tourism. While many tourism specialists have undoubtedly focused on the implications of COVID-19 on travel restrictions, this study aims to expand the scope of these restrictions to recognize them also as political tools, especially since the decision to reduce or refrain the sanctions of humanitarian travel during COVID-19 is a political decision in the first place. Therefore, this presentation discusses the degree of selectivity of border restrictions by global tourist destinations in order to provide a geopolitical perspective on the sanctions regime and restrictions on mobility in the context of tourism industry. As one of the world's largest industries, tourism affects and is affected by the spatial, social, political, and economic order and operates in an ever-changing political and economic environment at the international level. The increasing number of tourists crossing national borders every year, as well as globalization process and the increasing internationalization of tourism businesses and their supply chain have made tourism a potentially important geopolitical sector. For Rowan in 2016, tourism is not a simple leisure activity. It is a political instrument, a provocation to protest, and a stage of struggle with great stake for ethnic identity, national borders, and the territory of the state. Also noted that tourism is like a fundamental site through which geopolitical narratives are assembled. Nonetheless, given the pervasive application of sanctions as a blunt geopolitical instrument of post-Cold War governance, with their direct and indirect effects on tourism, research on sanctions is limited in the current literature on tourism, and also in geopolitics. This highlights the importance of developing a better understanding of this frequently deployed tool of economic policy and geopolitics, and of how tourism becomes a target or a victim of foreign policy decision making. A country or coalition of states enforcing economic sanctions should consider the impact on the human rights of the affected population, especially regarding their access to goods essential to life, including medicines and food, according to the Human Rights Watch in 2020. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, sanctions have had a devastating effect on the lives of citizens in a number of countries, including Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela, and largely affected the purchase of medicines, medical equipment, food, and other essential goods. For instance, Iran's capacity to respond to the pandemic is believed to be substantially impeded by unilateral economic sanctions imposed by the United States against Iran. This has also been commented by international human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch, which argue that United States renewed sanctions against Iran, like negatively affecting the Iranian government's ability to adequately respond to the mounting health consequences of the coronavirus pandemic. Although restrictions on international travel and the imposition of border controls have come to be regarded as standard mechanisms for restricting disease, their ability to be effective, in particular for countries with land borders, is often considered as rather limited. Imposing border and mobility controls serve to delay epidemic peaks and do not significantly reduce the extent of the spread, according to the World Health Organization in 2019. In addition, several studies carried out before COVID-19 have pointed out that the stigma of discrimination of people in areas affected by influenza and the economic consequences of the implementation of the border closures must also be taken into account. Nonetheless, travel restrictions have become a major approach to restrict COVID-19. Although it is intended for other states, economic and political sanctions are often best understood as being designed for a national audience in order to allow a government to show that it has done something about it, which concerns a political matter. This means that while they can have real social economic effects on the population of the target country, their political effects are more symbolic. Although they are generally not presented as such in the national media, the refusal of entry to foreign nationals or transport of certain countries, or even the limitation of the return of foreign nationals of a country in the event of a health crisis, are also forms of sanctions. This is particularly important in the case of pandemics such as COVID-19, as the aim of the international health regulations of the World Health Organization is to prevent, protect, control, and respond to the international spread of disease in a manner that is proportionate and limited the risk to public health, and which avoids unnecessary interference with trafficking and international trade. This is important because the objective of the IHR with respect to a public health emergency of international concern is to detect and contain at the source, especially since the guidelines for implementing the IHR state that plans should be created to ensure minimal disruption to passengers and cargo while maintaining a balanced approach to managing public health emergencies. And this was accorded to the World Health Organization in 2012. This does not mean that quarantine and border control measures are necessarily inappropriate, but that they are meant to be developed on the basis of health advice and full respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms rather than political concerns. The COVID-19 pandemic has generated considerable interest in the impact of border controls, travel restrictions on tourism and its recovery. These measures are often designed as health interventions. However, this presentation also suggests that decisions to employ mobility restrictions also have an important political dimension, which, depending on the context, is linked to domestic policy, foreign policy, or geopolitical strategies. The humanitarian dimension and human rights underline the inconsistent application of sanctions and their impact on populations in general, which is gradually increasingly recognized in the work on mobility and tourism justice. Mobility in a particular international, like in a most particular way, like in an international mobility, is inherently political. Under international law, there is no right to enter another country as a foreign national, and even the right to enter or to re-enter the country of citizenship can be circumscribed. Uh, in a larger context, the uncertainty surrounding COVID-19 pandemic and global mobility conclude that future studies should examine how tourism encounters both a challenge and a reinforcement of geopolitical narratives, and in what ways the geoeconomy of tourism takes into account its recently revealed wounds of structural inequalities. Well, this presentation show a little bit how sanctions have become a geopolitical tool to restrict mobility that has only recently become a focus of interest for tourism researchers. However, what is missing from the part of the current wave of research that focuses on the effect of COVID-19 on tourism is that sanctions are an integral part of how governments are responding to the pandemic and using measures that are part of foreign policy rather than health and humanitarian responses. Well, thank you for your interest. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope it clarifies some points about the geopolitical impact on tourism and some sanctions that are put in place by the government. Thank you again.